Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and I am host of the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. Each week, we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Lately, we've been added Plum Island to that agenda. I'm writing a book of about Plum Island after writing a book about the Merrimack River. So Plum Island is of great interest to all of us, I'm sure. And today we're going to be talking about a very well-known figure who spent time at Plum Island, and her name is Rachel Carson. Now, she might be known to the populace as the author of Silent Spring, which was written in 1962, which was considered one of the first environmental books that talked about the harm that pesticides were doing, that they were doing damage to birds, to the marsh, and to many kinds of wildlife. And Rachel Carson is of interest to me at this point because she was born in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, went to school in Chatham College near Pittsburgh, and then Johns Hopkins University. And she came up through, she was a wildlife writer for the federal government. And in 1947, she actually came to Newburyport, and she spent a lot of time on Plum Island. Here you can see a picture of Rachel Carson. If you're listening on radio, this is a woman who is in her mid-40s or so. She's out near the water. She's making an assessment of something she just pulled out of the ocean. It's in a jar, so she's studying some small foliage, perhaps. But she spent a lot of time in 1947 chronicling Plum Island, and these stories were in the U.S. wildlife, fish and game literature that went out quarterly, and she was a very well-known environmental writer. And one of the things that's interesting about 1947 on Plum Island is that there was a great battle going on between the bird watchers and the bird hunters. This is true. In 1942, a good part of Plum Island was given or was taken over by the federal government by Fish and Wildlife. They wanted to continue to permit fishing. There were a lot of hunters, and so they wanted to have hunting as well. But the Audubon Society owned quite a bit of Plum Island, and the Audubon Society did not want hunting. After all, bird watchers want to watch the birds, not shoot the birds. And so at one point, the Audubon Society had taken over much of the land, and they owned more than half of Plum Island, and they were going to zone it off so that there would be no bird hunting and no fishing. And this really did create a political stir, because there are thousands of hunters who came to Plum Island for bird hunting. It even got to Congress, as a matter of fact, and these hunters were saying, you know, don't take all of Plum Island, we want some of it for hunting. And so this was a major situation. It actually ended up on the desk of President Harry Truman in about 1946 or 47. And it was quite a push and pull back and forth. And in fact, one of the biographers of Rachel Carson said that Rachel and her partner, who would go out and help her with her research, used to quip, well, I hope you don't get shot today. And I hope they don't, excuse me, mistake us for a couple birds. And so they were joking, but there was a real animosity towards the federal government, and she was a federal employee. Anyway, she wrote a very long essay on Plum Island, excuse me, and she talked about the value of Plum Island, especially it's the largest waterfowl rest area in New England. And of course, many waterfowl would fly from the Arctic down to Florida or even farther south. And it was known as it is then as a resting stop. It's known as a flyway, and it was very important. She was concerned especially about the black duck, and so this was a duck that was actually losing its leverage here in New England. In the 1930s, you might recall, there was something in the Midwest called the Dust Bowl, and much wildlife was gone. There was a great deal of dust. Farmers were overwhelmed. Well, also bad weather came to New England in the 30s, and many of the ducks and waterfowl did not survive. So as a natural situation, there were fewer black ducks. But she wrote about the black ducks, and she actually chronicled the fact the black duck was making a comeback in 1947. So Rachel Carson was here for a whole summer. She wrote a long text about Plum Island, the value as a flyover area for and resting spot for birds. And she liked Plum Island very much. Now, as it turned out, there was a compromise on Plum Island. The Federal Wildlife Service got much of the island. The Audubon Society actually had to cede it to the wildlife refuge people. And in 1942 and beyond that, the Parker River Wildlife Refuge was created. And so it's just one of the interesting aspects that there was a compromise, and that even today, hunting is permitted on parts of Plum Island. You have to get a permit, of course, but it's not too well known that duck hunting is still done. And she was a very strong advocate. She was a writer at that time, but later she became more of an advocate for science. So Rachel Carson was here in 47. She wrote several books on the ocean. She was an oceanographer. But in about 1960, she became aware of research about pesticides. Now, many of the big companies in this country were using pesticides to kill mosquitoes. Now, that is still done. I think there's about 5 different companies just on the North Shore that kill mosquitoes. I mean, they have a whole fleet, but we won't go into that. But in the 1960s, there was research coming forth that indicated that a lot of birds and insects were being damaged by DDT and other strong pesticides. And as another local angle to this thing, Rachel Carson in 1958 got interested in this because a woman from Duxbury on the South Shore wrote to her and said, the birds in my backyard in our neighborhood are dying. I think it's because there's so much pesticides that are being put down to kill some of the bugs. Now, this is true. She was, a very significant figure at that time, but she opened this letter from this woman from Duxbury, printed in the Boston Herald later, which I used to work for the Boston Herald, not in 1958, I must say. But she became interested in this idea of pesticides. She was a very courageous woman because when she started writing essays about pesticides, many of the major industrialists really had a big vendetta against her because they were making an enormous amount of money on pesticides, but they, as it turned out, yes, they were killing birds and insects and many other things. And she kept going, and she wrote articles, and in 1962, her book came out, Silent Spring. And she was discredited in some areas by scientists who are probably on the payroll of the industrialists, but she testified in Washington. And, she was soft-spoken. She was about 55 at that time. I mention this because she died at the age of 57. So she was in her mid-50s. And she said, I'm not saying that we should ban all pesticides. I'm not saying, that we should never do this again, because obviously some insects are harmful. I am saying that we have to be more careful with the research. We have to be more aware that this can damage birds and wildlife. And so that was her point. And Silent Spring became a national bestseller and was considered one of the first major steps forward in the environmental movement. Because before that time, industry did basically what they wanted to. And here the Merrimack River was an example of that. People, many of the mills upriver would just put their garbage and their waste into the river, and it would flow down the Merrimack River. Of course, we're in Newburyport. We're at the end of the line. So for many years, the Merrimack River was quite polluted. Now, the older people in town will tell you that. They'll say, if I fell into the river and I came home, my mother would, put me into the bathtub and I'd get washed down, because there was a great concern that youngsters would be damaged, or some kind of impurity would give them a rash or give them a disease or something like that. And one of the interesting aspects about Rachel Carson, in my view, or one of her really intriguing deductions that she made public, was her awareness that DDT and some of these pesticides were getting into the systems of the birds. And when the birds laid their eggs, the shell was not strong enough, and shells were breaking in the nest, and thus new generation of birds were not being born, they were dying. And I find this to be one of the most remarkable discoveries, that somehow they had the wherewithal and the insight to say, geez, a lot of the eggs were broken this year. Could that be from DDT? And it turned out it was. And this was a significant moment in the environmental consciousness. And, you have enormous corporations like DuPont, for example. DuPont was a maker of DDT. They later made Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam, but we need not go there. But she was a very courageous woman who kept doing her research, writing her stories. Silent Spring came out in 1962. She was discredited by some in the industries, but many scientists backed her science. Now, one of the reasons she was so brave, in my view, is she did a lot of her greatest work when she was afflicted with cancer. I think in about 1961, she came down with breast cancer, kept working. Silent Spring was published in 1962. She kept working, tried to do as much as she could. And she was very attuned to public relations, and she wanted to speak at colleges and universities and other public gatherings. But by 1962, her cancer was quite serious. She died not long after that, at the age of 57. But Rachel Carson was really one of the early pioneers of the environmental movement. Her writing reached millions of people. She was a hero at the time. I think since then, she's become more of a hero because she went through so much, having to defend herself at congressional hearings and have these scientists hired by DuPont and others probably come up and say, this is bad science. This woman does not know what she's talking about. But she stayed out there. She was a very brave woman. She was ahead of her time. Now that came out in 1962. In 1969, the environmental movement had another step forward when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire. This is true. Chemical companies upriver were dumping so much effluent into the Cuyahoga River, it caught fire. And there were pictures and newspapers all across the country. I mean, it would be today even astounding. Did you see that photo? A river in Ohio caught fire because it was so polluted. So in 1969, that was a big turning point as well. And a number of federal officials in Congress said, we've got to do something. So they reorganized some small agencies and created the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in 1970. Richard Nixon was president then. His name is on the bill. John Mitchell, the Attorney General, who both Nixon and Mitchell got into big trouble for roguery during the Watergate scandal, but both of them were actually in the mix in 1970. Now, in 1972, Senator Edmund Muskie from Maine cobbled together bipartisan agreement, and the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972. Now, Nixon, even though he is credited with starting the EPA, he actually vetoed the Clean Water Act of 1972. But in those days, Democrats and Republicans talked to each other, unlike today, it appears, and the bill was passed over his veto. So in 1972, we got the Clean Water Act, and this helped the Merrimack River tremendously. All suddenly, sewage treatment plants and Newburyport, and Lowell, and Lawrence, and Haverhill all started getting federal money. And so that was the start of a cleaner Merrimack. And I think we know it is today. It's not perfect, but old timers would say it's much, much cleaner. There is a warning system when there is a discharge upriver by the sewage treatment plants, but everybody around attests to the fact that things are a lot cleaner than it was. And Rachel Carson was one of the initiators of the environmental movement. There's several Rachel Carson preserves, wildlife preserves in Maine. There's one in Wells, Maine. There's several further up the coast. And there are many places in New England that recognize her great work. But that's what I'm saying. She came here in 1947, spent a good time on Plum Island, wrote a long essay. It helped bring back the black duck. And she had a good fall here watching the birds. So she is one of the women who has been very helpful to the Merrimack River and to the North Shore. And by the way, this is Dyke Hendrickson. The podcast is Life Along the Merrimack. We're on Joppa Radio, 96.2 FM and Channel 9 local cable. And at this point, with that introduction to Rachel Carson, we're going to go through and talk about a couple other women who have been very helpful here in the Merrimack area. This is one of the great stars of the environmental movement, the first graduate of MIT. She was able to bring clean water to Lowell and Lawrence. She was a great scientist, and she went on to do a lot of good science. Here is Ida Lewis. She was a great lifesaver also in the 19th century. And now we're looking at a photo of spars. Spars were Coast Guard women who came together in the 40s during World War II. There was a great deal of interest along the waterfront to get more people to watch the waterfront, more people in the offices to help the war effort. And between 1941 and 1946, 12,000 women went into the spars, which was the Women's Coast Guard Unit. Now, in 1946, all of those women were mustered out, which is kind of too bad. But women were very valuable in the 1940s in the Coast Guard. And I wasn't fully aware of this until recently, but there was an enormous amount of ship sinkings off of the East Coast and South America in 1941 and 42. We did not have a good system to attack German submarines, and hundreds of ships went down off of New England, off of Long Island, off of North Carolina, hundreds. And so spars joined the Coast Guard effort, and they did a job in watching for enemies outside, but also working in offices and doing other services. I wrote a book called New England Coast Guard Stories and interviewed a number of women in the Coast Guard. Here is Rachel Cahoon. She was working in Rockland, Maine when I met her several years ago. She had gone to Ohio Wesleyan University. She wanted to be a teacher. And she had started her career in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard, as we must know by now, the birthplace of the Coast Guard was Newburyport, 1790. So everything we have out there started in Newburyport. Now, it wasn't until 1915 that the Coast Guard was so designated. The Revenue Cutter Service, which is what started here, merged with the Life-Saving Service, which was also started in Massachusetts, to become the Coast Guard in 1915. In 1939, the Lighthouse Service was added, and those three groups became the Coast Guard that we know today. But this is Megan Cahoon, and she was in the Coast Guard in Rockland. One of the great assets to the Merrimack River, and again, we're talking about women who have been very helpful in cleaning up the river or working for the river. This is State Senator Diana Zoglio. She lives in Methuen. She's done a lot for the river. She really had a strong voice starting about 3 or 4 years ago. And she was able to go into the State House and get about $100,000, with which was created the Merrimack River Commission. That brings more attention to the present day problems of the river. It also is going to be used to start a warning system. In other words, when the sewage treatment plants upriver have overflows and they let sewage out into the river, there will be a better informing system or a warning system. Senator Zoglio was on the podcast last week, and she talked about her next adventure, which is going to be running for state auditor. Now, as I understand it, there are only 6 statewide elective offices at the executive level. And this is a good one. It pays $185,000 a year. You get a driver, you get a car, you get a big allowance so you can go around the state and look for corruption. And so we all want to end corruption. Senator Zoglio evidently wants to end corruption. So she's going to be running for state auditor. She was one of the individuals who was involved in 2 years ago, there was a trip along the Merrimack River called the Voyagers, and about 24 people left New Hampshire and paddled down on kayaks the whole 117 miles along the Merrimack, and they ended on Plum Island. So she's energetic, resourceful, and has been doing a lot for the river in the years that she's been in the state Senate. This is Congresswoman Lori Trahan. She's from the Lowell area. She has been very helpful to the Merrimack River. There is federal money out there, low interest money, that communities can borrow from the federal government at like 1%. So this is very desirable. Now, during the Trump administration, there wasn't much money around. You couldn't get it. But with the Biden administration, they're taking applications again. And Congresswoman Trahan is trying to get low interest loans for sewage treatment plants in Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and places along the river. Now, it isn't true. These 3 cities are on notice from the EPA that you are polluting the river at times, and we can't have that. These cities are saying, and I believe with sincerity, well, we can't afford $100 million, even $20 million each year. We just, we're industrial communities. We don't have the money. So Lori Trahan, Congresswoman Trahan, is trying to get low-cost loans so these communities can fix up their sewage treatment plants. So she is another person who is really helping on the Merrimack River. Donna Holliday, the mayor of Newburyport, she's pictured here, has been a great aid to the river. I was with the Newburyport Daily News from 2012 to say 2017, and sometimes would ride with she and her aides as they inspected the river after big rainfalls. And one day we were there, it was in mid-April, and the river was brown, it really was. And this wasn't just because it was a cloudy day. it was looking bad. And so she was really energetic about, we've got to talk to those cities upriver. We've got to get a warning system for when they have their CSOs, combined sewage out discharges. And we've got to make the people know that from time to time the sewage is coming down. But she did a lot, and she went to a lot of meetings. And as a result, I think the river will be cleaner. There will be a warning system. She also has been helping the people of Plum Island. They're facing erosion. They're facing high tides. Now, this is a very difficult thing for a mayor, I would think. She was on the podcast several weeks ago, but it's a difficult thing. These are citizens, they pay taxes. They're right along the ocean. But as we know, tides can get high, storms can get stormy, and numerous houses on Plum Island, their Reservoir Terrace, are getting water into their basements, or if they're sometimes it'll get near their cars. It's a serious situation, but on the other hand, that's nature. I mean, she sometimes says, this is a very hard problem to deal with because this is nature. We know there's sea level rise. We know there's storms, and she has been very good about trying to get more money and more minds involved. Now, you could make the argument that you should not be building houses on the cusp of the ocean these days. But for whatever reason, houses have gone in recent years, and now some of them are facing erosion issues. But Mayor Holliday has been, a very effective campaigner for Plum Island. Several years ago, she got $5 million back from the engineering company who had messed up with the water system and with the sewage system. She's a lawyer. She was persistent. She got $5 million back. I mean, how can you make such an error? But some of you may remember the sewage system froze up. I think in 2015, the water system wasn't working well. So Mayor Holliday has had a very busy tenure. She's been in there for slightly more than a decade. She announced she's not going to run again, but she has been a real successful advocate for the Merrimack River. And here's a picture, one of my favorites. This doesn't relate to people who are working together now, of course. This was taken, this is a picture, if you're listening to the radio, of the female high school in Newburyport. The first tax-supported female high school in the country, it is said, 1844 to about 1856. And here you can see a lot of the girls outside. It looks like the trees are the leaves are off the trees, but the girls are dressed up. And the female high school existed for a little more than a decade, and then they consolidated. You've heard that term. And so it was closed down, and then, it burnt down in the 1865, 1866 period. But this is a lovely photo, I think, of the girls, the female high school of Newburyport in about 1850. And it's just a wonderful photo. This is in the archives of the Newburyport Library. But I bring it up because we were talking about women today. Most centrally, Rachel Carson, who visited Plum Island for a whole half a year in 1947, wrote a long story about Plum Island, later wrote the book Silent Spring, which was instrumental in the environmental movement. And then we talked about a number of the legislators who have been very helpful in cleaning up the Merrimack River and trying to keep Plum Island all in one piece. So that's it. I'm Dyke Hendrickson. This is the podcast, Life Along the Merrimack. We meet every week for about a half hour. Sometimes we have guests, sometimes we have slides like you saw today. This is 6.2 FM Joppa Radio. This is local channel 9 on local cable, and we'll be here again next week. And we look forward to talking about the Merrimack River, about Plum Island, and in general, life along the Merrimack. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we'll be here again in another week. Good afternoon.